we've had a nice turnout for post-Thanksgiving, stressful time in the semester. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rebecca Bowling, and I am the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities. And I'd like to welcome you to this last Humanities Forum event of the fall semester. We are thrilled to have Dr. Marci Reaven from New York Historical Society with us today. And I'm going to save the introduction of the speaker for Dr. Nicole King, as well as announcements about tomorrow's events. But I want to thank the Orser Center for the Study of Place, Community, and Culture, and the Department of History for co-sponsoring today's lecture. Dr. Nicole King is Assistant Professor of American Studies and the founding director of the Orser Center for the Study of Place, Community, and Culture, which I've asked her to say a few words about today prior to introducing today's speaker. After the talk, Dr. Reaven will entertain questions, followed by a light reception. So let me turn things over to Dr. King.
So good evening and welcome. Thanks for attending at this busy end of the semester point. So I would like to again thank the Drescher Center for the Humanities, the Department of American Studies, and the Department of History for making this final Humanities Forum of 2011 possible. So as Rebecca Bowling said, I'm Nicole King. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of American Studies and the director of the Orser Center. And the Orser Center for the Study of Place, Community, and Culture was founded in 2010, and the center's mission is the study and preservation of places through scholarly research, teaching, and civic engagement. The center supports UMBC's desire, as stated in its mission statement, to be a national model in promoting university community partnerships. And the center builds on the research and teaching of Ed Orser, who's sitting right here in the front row, who has been connecting UMBC students and the wider public with places in the Baltimore region since 1969, when he joined the Department of American Studies faculty at UMBC. Today's lecture is also part of, or kind of a kickoff for, the Be More Historic Unconference, which is tomorrow, Friday, December 2nd, from 8:30 a.m. until 3:30 p.m. at the Maryland Historical Society. So Be More Historic is a participant-led unconference on public history, historic preservation, and community development in the Baltimore region and across the state of Maryland. Organized in partnership between Baltimore Heritage, the Greater Baltimore History Alliance, the Maryland Association of History Museums, the Maryland Historical Society, the Maryland Historical Trust, Preservation Maryland, and the UMBC Orser Center. Be More Historic is an opportunity to connect with local historians, humanities scholars, preservation advocates, museum professionals, archivists, and anyone interested in exploring the vital intersections between people, places, and the past in Baltimore and Maryland. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the unconference model, unconferences are informal spaces for people to share their knowledge and discuss their work. The panels are created and managed by the participants, with the content of the conference determined the day of the event rather than in advance by the organizers. So tomorrow morning, those of us organizing it will be busily putting things together. Conference registration is currently full. We have over 100 participants signed up. But you can check out the fascinating blogs that people who've signed up for the conference have posted on the website, and it is Be More, as in B, the letter, and M-O-R-E. And we, of course, didn't think that up. People use that often. bemorehistoric.baltimoreheritage.org, or you can go to the Orser Center website and see more information about the conference. One thing for students who are here, I assume might be interested in public history and preservation and issues related to place. We are looking for a couple more student volunteers, so if you're interested, if this conference sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, please see myself or Eli Poussin, who is over there in the corner, who is one of the main, or who is the main organizer. He's a field officer with Baltimore Heritage. So now, moving to the reason we're all here tonight, I wanted to introduce Marci Reaven and to say how happy I am to have her at UMBC. Marci Reaven earned a Ph.D. in U.S. history from New York University. Her career in public history has included stints with the exhibit planning firm American History Workshop and City Lore, a nonprofit organization that documents and preserves New York City's living cultural heritage. While at City Lore, Reaven co-founded and directed Place Matters, a wide-ranging project to promote and protect places of history and tradition throughout the city, and co-authored the book Place Matters Guidebook to New York City, called Hidden New York, A Guide to Places That Matter, and was published by Rutgers University Press in 2006. And Marci Reaven, as Rebecca Bowling said, is currently Vice President for History Exhibits at the New York Historical Society. So this evening she will draw on her impressive wealth of experiences ranging from citywide surveys, historical sign projects, preservation efforts, community planning collaborations, films, digital projects, and exhibits to discuss the joys and the challenges of public history work. So please join me in welcoming Marci Reaven to UMBC.
Hi everybody, it's great to be here. Thank you. So thank you to the Orser Center, the Drescher Center, the Departments of History and American Studies, and to Professors King and Bowling. I was very happy to get this invitation. So the interest of the Orser Center in place, community, and culture are mine as well, and they have been for a long time. So I'm very happy to talk about the related work that my colleagues and I have been doing in New York. That work has covered many different organizations, as you've heard, but in generally, it's touched on place, community, culture, and history. So two of the projects that I'm going to talk about are ones that I've been directly involved in. One is a project that I've admired from afar. It's the Weeksville Heritage Center, run by some colleagues in Brooklyn. But before getting to the projects, there are 4 common concerns that link these projects and that I think are important to public history. So I wanted to talk about those first and then show some images. So I'm interested in featuring stories about people who struggle to make a difference on any scale, whether the purpose of their work attempts some significant political change, like a social welfare leader named Neva Deerdorf that I learned about a couple of years ago, who worked in the 1940s and 50s to add a tier of citizen participation to New York City government, or whether their goals are smaller but still contribute to social well-being, like Mike Amadeo, who runs the oldest Latin music store in the city and whose knowledge of the music has made him a living link to the history of a particularly wonderful type of Latin music development in New York City after the World War II. My focus on engaged individuals partly reflects my own interest in political activism, but it also acknowledges that showing individuals confronting challenges and seeking to resolve conflicts is a good way to create interest in any topic. Telling stories about people who strive to make change, to make history, whether it's writ small or large, is a powerful way to connect with audiences. So there's an instrumental interest in there too, as a professional public historian. I also believe in telling history in a way that includes a variety of perspectives and experiences and a broad array of historical actors. This is partly because I think such inclusive interpretation makes for a fuller, more interesting, and more accurate history, one that reveals the individual actions and broader societal forces that are responsible for change or continuity over time. But I also try to tell an inclusive story because the people who consume our projects, the visitors to museums and websites and passers-by and historical sign projects, are diverse. And they deserve to see how people like themselves responded to the challenges and opportunities of their day and fit into the larger story of American history. The category of place is another important component in the projects that I'm attracted to. It's a component that enriches historical storytelling and makes the past more memorable for many of us. One can interpret places as catalysts for historic events, but also as settings that make historical developments tangibles. So to give you an example, I'm working right now on an exhibit about World War II and New York City. This is for the New York Historical Society. And we're using the notion of place in both of these respects. So for example, during the war, a huge proportion of the men and supplies sent off to battle shipped out literally through New York City, over 3 million of them. So the city's great port acted as a catalyst. Its industrial transportation and maritime infrastructures, the people involved in operating them, and the geography of this incredible harbor in itself all made possible a remarkable series of activities and events and really helped to win the war. But in the same exhibit, we're also using place more generically as a setting. We want to discuss the ways that daily life changed dramatically for New Yorkers after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And so we're going to use ordinary spaces like the home, the school, the museum, as sites where those changes, and some of them were quite profound, took place. Another of my interests has been using public history to stimulate historical reflection and positive action in contemporary civic life. One strategy that I've tried to employ is to collaborate not only with organizations in the arts and humanities, but also in the civic sector, believing that our different yet complementary skills, social and professional connections, and forms of knowledge and know-how will have greater reach and impact if we're working together. So all four of these approaches thread through, and I hope you'll see the connections in the projects that I'm going to show you now. So in 2010, while I was still on staff at the cultural organization CityLore, I curated an exhibit called Nueva York. It's the slide that's up there. The exhibit was about the centuries-old relationship between New York and the Spanish-speaking world. And that's Spain and Spanish America. The sponsors were New York Historical Society, a history museum, a Museo de Barrio, an art museum, and it was mounted at El Museo in this art museum. For those of you who know the city, that's 5th Avenue and 104th Street. So our presentation ran counter to the conventional historical narrative in two significant ways. We showed that New York had maintained significant connections to Spain and Spanish America for centuries. New York's key links were not just with Europe, or maybe with Africa if slavery was the topic. Such connections aren't surprising when you consider how much power Spain wielded in the Americas from the 15th century on. Spain is all that red territory, which normally doesn't get accounted for. But New York's involvement in this history is not something that's generally known. So all of those white lines are trade lines, and there was not just a triangle trade. Trade just didn't go the three neat directions. It went all over the place, and New York was heavily tied to the Caribbean and to all of Latin America. We also showed that people of Spanish and Spanish American descent had been an important part of New York City history. They hadn't just come to the city after the Second World War, as was commonly thought, and that's 1945, so that's pretty recent. So we were bringing their migration back many years before. So we reinterpreted the city as a place and a population, and we said that Latinos were not newcomers. In fact, they numbered among the earliest immigrants to New York, and therefore they belonged to the city as much as anybody else. So it's a political statement as well as an historical statement. So just one object that was in the show, this religious statue has Hispano-Philippine origins. It came to New York through Mexico. Mexico was the star of Spain's territory in the New World, and somehow this beautiful thing traveled to the city. It was one of the first Catholic objects come into the city. It came in the 1780s. The Catholic Church hadn't been allowed to establish itself until then, but the Spanish elite started coming to the city as soon as the British left after losing the War of Independence, and the first Catholic church was built then. We not only recast the position of New York in relationship to Spain and Spanish America, so I'm trying to make a point about place here. You know, we changed the notion about what kind of place New York was in relationship to the rest of the world. We also investigated how particular places in the city, and notably the Port of New York, helped to foster these international linkages. So this map was part of an interactive device that let visitors see how the sugar refining industry prospered in New York, using using sugar grown by slaves in the Caribbean. Sugar became one of the most important sources of both maritime and manufacturing wealth in New York, actually, in the 19th century. One of the real surprises revealed by the exhibit was the depth of New York's connections with Cuba. So firms like Novelty Iron, depicted here, which is often seen in historical exhibits in New York, exported equipment for sugar mills that were used in Cuba and other places around the Caribbean. And that that kind of business fueled industrial development in New York, but it's a mystery. Nobody knows that, that history about New York. The exhibit also worked against convention by partnering a history museum with an art museum. That relationship wasn't particularly easy. There were tensions over how much art should be included in the exhibit and whether art history had a role in the historical narrative. But despite such tensions, which are hardly uncommon in these kind of interdisciplinary partnerships, I found that such collaborations do bring a lot of benefits that you can't obtain otherwise. So in this case, the tensions prompted us to look far and wide for artwork that could be integrated into the narrative. In the end, I think this enriched the exhibit, and it also appealed to many different kinds of people. Some people came and told me that all they liked was the art. Some others didn't pay any attention to it. But it's nice to cover your bases in that way. It helps to keep audience members happy. And these are two works, for example, that we were prompted to locate. They're both by Francisco Oller, who was a very distinguished Puerto Rican painter in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So on the left is a kind of amazing painting that has never been seen, really, since it was painted in the United States. It's President McKinley, painted just as the US established its colonial hold over Puerto Rico in 1898. And if you can see, the map of Puerto Rico is rolled up in his left hand. On the right is a landscape by Oller of Hacienda La Fortuna. It was a Puerto Rican sugar plantation that sold its sugar to New York for refining. So it was the kind of source for New York sugar. Being partnered with an art museum also led us to work with a contemporary artist, which we probably wouldn't have done otherwise. Antonio Martorell created an art installation for the exhibit that doubled as a theater for a film about Puerto Rican migration to New York. So this was a concluding experience to the exhibit and one of two elements that brought the story up to the present, because otherwise the exhibit ended at 1945. The theater's design was in the shape of an airplane, or an Airbus, as it had been dubbed in a famous story about Puerto Rican migration after World War II that was based on its frequency and its back and forth characteristics. So the chairs were designed and dressed, you can see the costumes there, by community artists who worked with Antonio, and each one was meant to recall a migrant. Viewers to the show literally sat in their laps. And the portholes of the plane held images of community scenes and leaders. What was remarkable about this installation was that it reinforced community in multiple ways, and even just preparing for this talk, I thought about more ways that it worked. So it was kind of one of those really deep installations. I have a lot of respect for him. So one thing it did is it reinforced bonds among the Puerto Rican artists who worked on it, and between them and the museum, El Museo, where it was, where the exhibit took place. And that was a relationship that had been strained in recent years. So there was a lot of good came out of that bonding. It also reinforced bonds among Puerto Rican and other Latino visitors by addressing historical memories that they rarely saw inscribed in public. El Museo is located in East Harlem, which is a traditionally Latino neighborhood in New York. So while this installation could have taken place in Midtown Manhattan, let's say, it certainly resonated more deeply being located in this traditionally Latino neighborhood. And by traditionally, I mean back to the 1930s. It was other things earlier than that, but it's been largely Latino since then. The installation also did something else, though. It sought to create a new feeling of community in the broadest sense by creating ties among all the visitors to the exhibit, not just Latinos, but between everybody who came there, and between them and the migrants of the past. And it did it by literally seating the visitors in the laps of these historical actors and making everybody a participant of sort in this experience. So again, it was playing with the notion of place in numerous ways and using that to build community. Antonio's installation and the film it hosted also helped us foster a positive relationship with visitors, or more precisely, avoid a fractious one, and that's an important goal for public presentations. Our exhibit ended, as I mentioned, with World War II, and we worried that this would fly in the face of visitor expectations and seemed to dismiss the importance of the very much larger migrations of Latinos and Latin Americans that had taken place after World War II. If we hadn't included this installation and another very large demographic map that showed contemporary neighborhoods, most Latino visitors would not have seen their experiences addressed in the exhibit. And now, in my experience, establishing a relationship of trust with the audience or with project participants is one of the great challenges of public history projects. So this doesn't mean that projects should risk compromising their integrity to adhere to people's preconceptions or expectations in some kind of knee-jerk way. But I think that if you ignore those expectations, you risk turning people off to your work before they even see what you have to offer. So switching to another project, Weeksville, the ones my colleagues run. Gaining and keeping the confidence of user groups is something central to the approach of the Weeksville Heritage Center. The center is a historic site museum based around 3 little houses that date from the early 19th century, when slavery ended in New York, or it began its gradual end, and free African Americans purposely created a community for themselves in an area that's now known as Crown Heights in Brooklyn. So the houses were rediscovered in the 1960s in an effort to recover the largely lost history of African Americans in New York, in early New York. The subsequent renovation and transformation of the houses into one of the city's newest historic house museums and one of the few interpreting Black history in an African American neighborhood has entailed a decades-long effort requiring passion, determination, and resourcefulness by museum professionals and a great number of community residents. So the Weeksville Heritage Center maintains closer relations with its neighborhoods, with its neighbors and constituents than any other interpretive institution in New York City that I know of. There's an unusual amount of exchange between visitors and staff, and the institution maintains its original commitment to community empowerment. So it's notable for the way in which it probes deeply into the connections between the historic Black community and the contemporary Black community. And it makes those connections a centerpiece of its interpretation. So themes like economic self-sufficiency, self-determination. What did I do? I think if I hit escape, that'll get rid of it. Yes, very good. I was in danger, you know, of killing the whole thing, so. So again, economic self-sufficiency, self-determination, and the importance of establishing safe places are all themes that, that link the past to the present in Crown Heights, what was used to be known as Weeksville, and it influences the choice of topics for the Weeksville Heritage Center. So, for example, a recent program compared today's green movement to the frugal ways that Black Brooklynites have long maintained to survive in a system that's been well stacked against them. So you've always been green was the theme, and that's what prompted the discussion about conserving resources in the past and the present. The houses themselves have been interpreted to recall 3 eras in the history of Weeksville. This is the 1930s house. And the survival of these houses, first by neglect and luck, and later by intentional historic preservation campaign, is key to Weeksville's effectiveness as a teaching tool. So the presence of these houses provides concrete evidence of the community's historic existence, which is doubly important for histories that have been marginalized. Plus, as many historic sites do, the surviving physical fabric makes the stories of the past more tangible and memorable. Let's see if this is easier, yeah. In the grounds surrounding the houses, Weeksville holds many public programs featuring accomplished writers, musicians, and public figures, and this is becoming a more and more important part of their programming. One day-long program focused on Haitian and African independence, and quite purposely it was held on Emancipation Day, the anniversary of slavery's demise in New York, and the historical moment when a community like Weeksville could be founded. So it was an exuberant day of talk and music, and it's the kind of event that's making Weeksville kind of a center, a growing attraction for people around the world. So it's not just drawing its audience from New York City anymore, but it's pulling from visitors, millions of visitors that come to the city. And they are starting to feel about Weeksville as their home too, which is the purpose and the mission of the institution. So what intrigues me about Weeksville as a public history project is that it's an authentically historic place that tells a slice of New York's past that's actually not told anywhere else. And it fosters community through that place in a number of interesting ways. So it celebrates African American community building in the past and the present. It keeps that notion alive. It directly serves and sustains its local community. And it's building through its public programs a new community of people who are not necessarily a geographic community, who respond to its particular blend of kind of creative programming and welcoming atmosphere and rootedness in the past, but yet attentiveness to the present. That's not an easy mix to sustain, but they seem to be successful at it. So to the last project that I'd like to talk about, this is Place Matters, the one that you heard about a little bit earlier. Until recently, I was the managing director of Place Matters. I was the director of Place Matters, the managing director of City Lore, which is a cultural organization in New York. And in 1998, together with the preservation and planning group called Municipal Art Society, we started this Place Matters project. The idea was to promote places that connect us to the past, that keep the city a distinctive place, and that foster longstanding cultural traditions. We began the project because we were convinced that there were places throughout the city that contributed to the well-being of New Yorkers, like this grotto in the Bronx that was built in the 1930s, that some families used as a sanctuary during the worst years of the destruction and fires in the 1970s and 80s. But we were also aware that places like this received little public attention. I mean, of course, this is going to be truer of a place like the Grotto than of a building in Midtown Manhattan, let's say the New York Times building. But in general, places don't get enough attention. Scholars of place have called it a powerful, though often unacknowledged condition of human experience. And that was something we tried to change with the Place Matters project within the sphere that we could reach. So it seemed crucial to us at the beginning of our project to start inventorying places that mattered so they wouldn't remain invisible. And if they were endangered by development, we hoped that that existing inventory would provide information about their importance that would be available for advocates to use. So Bohemian Hall, shown here, is a Czech cultural organization created in 1910 that still sustains the cultural traditions of that community. It's also one of the city's last public beer gardens. The hall was an early entry to our inventory, and Place Matters helped list the building on the National Register of Historic Places. That was an honorary designation only. It doesn't actually protect the building, but it did provide it a legitimacy that helped it survive when the place was threatened about a decade or so ago. Now what's happened to save the place is its beer garden, actually, because it's now just about one of the more crowded places in New York City. But at the time, it wasn't working. Another place that mattered, that was an early entry to the inventory, was the Huame Bird Garden. This is a wonderful kind of purposely built little garden in a larger park in the Lower East Side that was created specifically for a group of elderly Chinese men who partake in a very old tradition of bird care and appreciation, which has been transferred, the Huame bird, which has been transferred to New York with their migration. So Place Matters calls its inventory the Census of Places That Matter. Nominations for places come from members of the public, and all 700+ entries are listed on this website. This is the first ground-up survey of places in the city. It's also a platform that individuals and small communities of interest around the city can use to contribute their insider knowledge about places to a larger and more public forum. You know, sometimes places like to keep their insider knowledge inside, but many places find it beneficial to promote themselves to the wider world, and so Place Matters has acted as that kind of facilitator. Nominations trigger the posting of the place to the census. So then, as often as possible, PlaceMatters staff and associates will add photos and researched written profiles to that posting. So it's an ongoing process based on both wide participation and targeted curation that brings together these different types of expertise. The historian Mike Frisch called this kind of practice shared authority, and it's making the census into a survey, guidebook, encyclopedia, and archive all rolled into one. PlaceMatters also works with individuals and organizations on educational and preservation advocacy projects. So for this sign project, PlaceMatters worked with a coalition of groups on the Lower East Side to record local stories from local residents. The stories were then used as the basis for these historic signs. So our goal was to mark places on the landscape that would acknowledge the continued existence of a multicultural population from many different economic backgrounds that itself was becoming more and more invisible and rather disrespected as the neighborhood was going through a very intense gentrification process. So the project was called Your Guide to the Lower East Side, and it was done in I think the jazzy design helped, the individual stories helped. We also used many languages. This particular sign is in both Greek, which Greek Jews were a big part of the neighborhood at one point. This particular sign was done in Greek and English, but there were some signs done in many languages. The signs outside this church were done in Spanish, Chinese, and English because that's the background of the congregations that go to that church. I think that these signs worked. For one thing, they still have not come down. They were supposed to be up for about 6 months, and this is some years later now. And they've never been graffitied, which is kind of incredible. Because you see they're actually at arm height, and you're not supposed to do that. We were also experimenting with making cheap signs, and so we figured if they were graffitied, we could replace them, but in fact, we haven't had to. So some of our most interesting projects have brought the storytelling skills of the public humanities to partnerships with groups working in very different fields. To give one example, in the South Bronx, we worked with the Community Development Corporation to tell the development of Latin music there. This was the Tropicana nightclub. There's a very famous one was located in Havana, Cuba. This was named after that. But it was the kind of place that once populated the streets of the South Bronx. It was not called the South Bronx then, but this was the kind of place that you could find everywhere. And it was part of a critical mass of musicians and clubs, record stores, dance halls, and theaters that were the venues where this distinct form of Latin music was created that I mentioned earlier after the war. But in the 1970s, a really disastrous combination of public and private disinvestment, loss of jobs, and arson created scenes like this one all over the borough, or all over this lower part of the borough. It's actually when it started to become the South Bronx. And the more the borough burned, the larger the area of the so-called South Bronx became. This is Charlotte Street. President Carter, another C, actually visited here in the 70s. But this was not an atypical looking part of the city. So when the physical sites disappeared or turned to other uses, very often churches, like the one shown here, the historical memory of the music and the social fabric that sustained that musical scene also disappeared. So to construct an account of this past, PlaceMatters recorded oral histories. We collected visual and other kinds of evidence of the places and the people. And then we created an assortment of public projects to convey that information in a variety of different formats and to many different kinds of audiences. A number of the public programs matched youngsters and old-timers. You might not be so happy being called an old-timer, but because that generational transmission of knowledge was really important to the Community Development Corporation that we were working with. The young kids couldn't believe that their parents and their aunts and uncles had been such great dancers or had been such creative musicians. So it created an important kind of family and community bonding. We also created tours for school kids who kids who might have lived in this neighborhood, but because of the destruction, didn't realize that the places they passed every day were actually had such an interesting history. We created tours that linked the Latin music history of, let's say, the 40s to the 60s through the hip-hop history, which began in the 80s and which was also part of the same neighborhood. So it's a very creative neighborhood, as you can see. And the tours also brought potential shoppers to Casa Amadeo, which was the last of the original Latin music places left. The gentleman standing outside is Mike Amadeo, who I mentioned earlier, and he's still there. I'm actually trying to include the store in my World War II exhibit, so I was just visiting him the other day. He's still there. We also helped to list the building to the National Register of Historic Places. And incredibly, it was the first place on the US mainland to be listed to the National Register that was connected to Puerto Rican history. So this has not been an overdone topic, to say the least. We also produced a film, a documentary film, feature length, public conversations with academic and community scholars, live music performances, this was one of them in a local park, and many more. So I mean, once you do that kind of in-depth research, there's really no limit to what you can do with that material, and that's what's pretty exciting about it. So our community development partner hoped that recovering this evidence of the community's creativity and entrepreneurship would contribute to a cluster of efforts targeted at local revitalization. And this was not the only kind of thing they were doing. But important places were a part of this mix, and that's what was exciting to us, that the places in the histories had a seat at the table. This notion of comprehensive asset-based community development, where local assets are seen as the building blocks of sustainable progress, is an approach that civil society organizations have increasingly pursued over the last couple of decades. But the kinds of entities or organizations that usually take part are, community development corporations, housing, transportation groups, faith organizations, churches and synagogues and mosques, planning and economic development agencies, maybe social justice groups, local politicians, etc. Humanities scholars are generally not in that group, and that's the point I want to make. More recently, federal agencies under Obama have embraced this notion as well. And this seems to have elevated interest in place and placemaking, which is great for those of us who care about that. The disturbing news out of Washington, though, is that Congress has just defunded one of the most important of these projects, which was called the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, that involved transportation, energy, and housing. But there is still much of this work going on. So I think it's important to pay attention to. And again, I mention this today because humanities practitioners don't tend to be part of these groupings. It's not across the board, but we are generally not in the room when these kinds of projects are going on. But I believe that we can and we should be, because I also believe we have a lot to contribute. So for one thing, we're well positioned to recognize, survey, and explain the importance of a broad range of places that matter to all kinds of people. We can talk about the long-standing gathering places, the stores that carry specialty goods that sustain community traditions, the historic sites that have never been recognized by official preservation bodies. So for example, in New York City, there were no landmarks connected to the history of organized labor until 2003, when Place Matters, in concert with labor unions and other kinds of labor history groups, proposed landmark designation for the former Triangle Shirtwaist factory building, which probably many of you have heard about. It was where there was a terrible industrial accident in 1911. 147 mostly young women died, and that accident led to tremendous changes in health and safety regulations after that. But nobody was really paying attention to that building outside of the union movement, nor any other place connected to organized labor in the city. Humanities practitioners can also identify what's specific and authentic to particular neighborhoods, towns, or cities. So I recently heard the urbanist Witold Rybczynski discuss what for him are the top 10 elements of a well-planned city. And the one thing he stressed was the need to look at each situation afresh. So as tempting as it is, he was saying, to copy ideas, even if they're good ones, ideas don't work everywhere. You have to know the context of where you're working and think about the particulars that will gain audiences and attract attention and use local assets. So applying this point about authenticity back to the Bronx, this park right here where this concert took place was a disaster 20 years ago. It was a haven for drugs and crime and a place to be avoided at all costs. Worse, it was located across from a public school, making it even all the more dangerous. So thankfully, local residents decided to take action, and eventually they managed to turn the park around. Today, Park 52, it's named that for the PS 52 across the street, not only functions the way a typical park should, but it hosts nighttime music concerts all summer long, provides a forum for local leadership development, and serves as an historical marker of homegrown courage, organization, and accomplishment. But this is just the kind of asset that could be missed if planners don't know where or how to look. I can easily imagine a development scenario where a park like this one is torn down without the planners and the politicians realizing or acknowledging that with incredibly small amounts of money, a place like this does a world of public good. Public humanities practitioners can be able advocates for such places and communities. We're trained to comprehend change and continuity over time, to recognize the source of expressive forms of culture and the actions of a broad range of historical actors. We're also trained to look closely at power arrangements and conventional narratives about community histories and question whether we're really getting the full story. Place Matters itself is a partnership of a humanities and an urban planning group, and part of its original mission was to promote more cross-disciplinary collaboration in the advocacy for historically and culturally significant places. The focus of my own work has shifted, and so I'm not working so directly on place, but I'm glad that a place like the Orser Center and many of you who are taking part in this kind of work are still involved in that kind of mission, because I think it's really a crucial one. So I'm particularly happy to be here today. Thanks.
Sure. Questions? Comments?
As a public historian in training, one of the things that you mentioned that really caught my ear was this idea of figuring out how to get the stakeholders to trust you. And in particular, it's a little difficult for, at the university level, working in practicum and creating partnerships between the university and constituents in the community surrounding the university. Do you have any pointers on building that trust and, just kind of making sure that the stakeholders receive something out of what us as public historians are trying to do?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think projects like this done in the school setting, and they're wonderful, but it's hard to do work within the framework of the semester or the year. I actually tried to do that myself recently as a teacher, an adjunct teacher at NYU, and made a lot of mistakes, so I know how hard it is. I think you should continue to try, but I think that maybe some things that could help would be if there's a way to work over time with one group. I know that every project has different organizational demands, and I don't know whether this would be possible, but I think there's something, whenever I have tried to work, or in all of the cases where I've worked with groups that were not part of humanities or arts organizations, I've always seen that there's a problem of timing, how to get the schedules to work. I don't mean the daily schedule, but the patterns of life and commitments. And So I think to the extent that projects can be organized over a longer period of time, that probably would help to build some trust. Alternatively, one could frame the project so that what you're attempting is smaller than you might otherwise be tempted to do. I think as a young person coming into a field, it's hard to judge how long it takes to get something done. And that's part of the learning process. And I think that if you keep the projects a little bit smaller, you probably can do them better and not set up expectations among your community partners about a level of work that you'd be able to contribute. Another thought, which I try to do, this is not easy, is to try to figure out what your partner actually needs rather than what you want to give them. Sometimes you might come in gung-ho to do an exhibit, but they might not need an exhibit. What they really might need is for you to go through the god-awful file cabinets filled with papers that stretch back, to 1985 that nobody's ever organized. Because if you would do that for them, they maybe could get access to their history better. Or maybe what they really need is for you to use your storytelling skills and your writing skills, which is something that people outside the university tend not to have, and to create a written profile or a binder filled with background reports that they can then use to create fundraising proposals and press releases and other kinds of things. So I think the more you can listen to your community partners, which is a great skill, listening skill, which to cultivate in all regards in public history. I think it's helpful in oral history, it's helpful in interviewing people, it's helpful in listening to your community partners, it's helpful in listening to the partners in your team that you're working with. It's this incredibly simple technique, but most of us don't do it very well. So I would say listening and writing are among the best things that one can learn. And I'm not being sarcastic. Those are some thoughts, but I'm happy to, if you have some ideas, please say them and I'm happy to respond to.
My question kind of is along the lines of that wonderful first question, but with Place Matters and the Census of Places, there is so much community involvement of people putting their stories and their places up. And were there methods for going about and getting people to actually engage with that that you use? Because I mean, it's a very successful model for community actual engagement with the project.
It's a good question. It's really an important piece of the project, which lately, as funding gets tight, it alters for all of us the ways that we're able to work, and this has certainly had an impact for us. But over time, we've done many different things to get that kind of, taken many steps to get that kind of community involvement or public involvement in the project. Sometimes we've gone to sit in libraries, set up a table and put out some paper. Libraries or community festivals, things that I'm sure you all have done, just to catch people in the places where they're already going. We have also identified particular neighborhoods that we were going to focus on. And then we would spend a lot of time calling up local organizations and trying to figure out who the community leaders were, and just setting up, trying to figure out what were the networks that made a community work, and what were the places that people, where were the places that people gathered. And then using those identified social networks, we would start investigating, we would start holding small meetings and asking people to talk about places. Other times we have developed a relationship with a particular community organization like the East Harlem Historical Society, wanted help identifying places in their neighborhood. And we set up a series of 3 public events around themes that made sense to them as a historical organization, invited a lot of people. And the more fun the events, of course, are, the better that they work, the more people show up. So if there can be music, if there can be food, I'm sure this is not news to anybody here, the more likely it is that people will show up. And then local people were invited to be storytellers. They would get up, they would talk about their experiences. And often, you know, people don't, because place is such an unrecognized part of our lives generally, people will be more likely to talk about their stories that were important to them, you know, their school, particular maybe heroes in the neighborhood. They'll talk about stories before they talk about places. But once you hear the stories, you can figure out that there are places, right, that are hosting them. So we've done all of those kinds of things. I think it's very important to have that face-to-face connection. Web is just not enough.
Yeah, you just pointed out something to me. Sometimes, you know, we talk about diaspora, right? So we have, you know, people from a particular area and they come to another place, and it's part of that country or that ethnic diaspora. But what I'm finding is we have the diaspora of place, so that I have an area where I work and what I try to do, and the people who once lived there who have the stories aren't there anymore. And it's the people who are now there have different stories, right? And it is amazing to some people to find out that even though it's a small place, and even though there's not many people and a lot of people are dying that used to live there and some of the buildings are gone, they're incredibly surprised to find that the people who are no longer there are very willing to come back and talk about it. Because, you know, they're all dead, who cares, it's a little place, they're just so excited to find out that somebody remembers it. Right. And the problem is how do you find them?
Find the ones who have moved away.
The ones who have moved away. You know, I mean, part of it becomes a clever use of, you know, genealogy and family history and trying to figure out who's related to who's around and reaching those. But when you're talking about a small place that's not in a city, that is, it makes it a little bit more, it's like the reverse problem, right? So that it's, you know, it was immigrants once all from one place, now those descendants have all gone somewhere else. Right. And all of a sudden it's a new group that they're a member of. So.
Yeah, I mean, they can also be often traced through those ethnic organizations. But just to do the flip side, what I think often can happen is that the people who move away don't care very much about the people whose experience, the people who are there now, or their experience. And that can be, that kind of mutual disrespect can be very dispiriting and not productive to saving places or building community. One thing we tried to do, it was logistically hard, but you made me think about this one example with the sign project that I was showing you. There was a very important gathering space for Jewish intellectuals in the Lower East Side. It was in a cafeteria. It was a very, you know, funky cafeteria called The Garden, but people loved it, and it was legendary. And many famous writers and reporters used to gather there. So The Garden is no more, but what's now there is a Chinese restaurant. And so we wanted to create a historical sign that would point out the garden. But, you know, luckily it dawned on us, well, if we're going to point out the garden, we really need to deal with this Chinese restaurant that's there, because if we ignore it, I mean, how disrespectful is that? So we then had to go we added to our work, of course. We now had to deal with the Chinese restaurant. We had to squish it onto the same sign. We had to add more languages, talk to people who didn't, you know, who were not English speaking, so we had to figure out how to do that. But then once we did it, we found out to our great delight that it was actually a really interesting story, which you often find out once you start going out and talking to people. It was a restaurant that had been about to go under, and the workers who worked there decided not to let it go under, you know, just like the big auto factories, and they bought it. And so it was like a cooperative Chinese restaurant owned by the employees. So we were able to tell that story. I had never figured out what the proprietors of the restaurant actually thought about all of this. But I think it was certainly a more effective public history project as a result. So those kinds of relationships between old residents and new residents are really interesting ones.
graduate student here in the public history program. I just have a quick question about sustainability. In doing any kind of project, we always see the end result, or we're always looking towards the end result. Could you speak a little bit more about how you build sustainability into, say, a project, a place, and how you just ensure that it moves on over time rather than sort of has this end point where everything kind of decays?
That's a tough one.
I can narrow it down.
Yeah. Well, money, I think, was money is always a trouble. I think since I'm hammering away at this notion of partnerships today, I'll use that as a little hook here. Save me. I think that is where partnerships actually do help a lot. So just thinking about this Latin music project in the Bronx, this one that I was showing. I mean, that's I think a good example of the kind of project that happens out here, you know, in civic society, and that doesn't have lots of big corporate money or federal money. So this is a community development corporation that has done very well by hook or by crook. It's an arts-driven CDC. And there is no one thing that they do that can last for years and years and years, because they're always having to go after, in an opportunistic way, the funds that are available and the resources that are available. But by partnering with many different organizations, they can keep enough projects going on over time and bring in different kinds of money and bring in different kinds of expertise that they're always moving forward. So we worked with them over a period, just using our relationship. They have partnerships with many more people. This is the Point Community, their name is the Point Community Development Corporation. They're in the Hunts Point neighborhood of the Bronx. And so we worked with them for about 5 years. And that core historical investigation we did played out in a number of different projects. Like I said, there were conversations, public conversations, there were concerts, et cetera, and we did what we could as money came in and as ideas came in and as new partners came in. Some things didn't work. We tried a program of tours. That didn't work. They just couldn't make it economically viable, so we dropped that. We got money for a film at one point from PBS, so all of a sudden we had a film. The film was over, but we had footage. They decided that, footage, stuff that we had shot that didn't get used in the film. They decided that they wanted to create a visitor center in their big, beautiful space in Hunts Point, which also hosts a school and many different kinds of after-school classes and environmental programs. But if they had a visitor center, then people would know their story and it would give them a kind of visibility. So they used the footage that we filmed for the film, and they didn't have to pay for it. So it's just that kind of constant it's kind of creativity, resourcefulness, partnering, sharing of expertise, getting angels, funding angels when you can. But I think that's really the best strategy for sustainability that at least I've seen.
Maybe time for one more question. Okay. Then we can continue with the reception.
Okay. You're the last one standing, okay.
Even though I'm still sitting down. Well, thank you very much for a very informative and helpful presentation. I have sort of a selfish question because I'm involved in the exhibition team right now that's working on an exhibit called Places of Invention. Oh. So I understand, and we have a number of community partners that we're developing through affiliate museums and such. So how do we bring the vibrancy of these activities outside the galleries into the exhibition design and planning itself? I love the airplane in the Barrio Museum. Yeah. How do you have other examples or ideas about how you get that sense of place and that sense of involvement that is coming out so clearly in the other examples that you're giving us into the four walls of the gallery?
so funny that you should say that, because I'll have to confront that for the first time. You know, now that I'm a museum person, this is my first job with a museum. I've worked on exhibits for museums, but not in a museum. So for the first time, it's going to be my job to get people inside. And I've always had this fun experience of just kind of working in the city up until then. I don't know. You know, I'm going to be learning about it like you, but I think that this model of, if you can, of partnering with people who have very intense connections with the outside world is a good one. You know, so the Antonio Martorell model, if you can, is a good one, because, you know, we're a divided society, and I don't know who you're trying to get, who normally comes, who doesn't come. I don't know any of those details. But we're still a pretty divided society. And so, you know, for example, when City Lore would do public programs, you know, the Jews would come to the Jewish. The Jews actually are more ecumenical than anybody else. The Jews would kind of come to everybody's program, more or less. But, you know, the Latinos came to Latino programs. The African Americans more came to African American programs. The Africans more came to African programs. You know, it tends to break down like this. So if you are trying to get the city into your space, I think the more you can work with people from these different communities who self-identify with these different groups, the stronger the likelihood of that happening will be. So I think that's just absolutely key. Making partnerships, the things that museums do, you know, the New York Historical Society works with the Museum of the City of New York, works with the Jewish Museum, works with the Intrepid. That works too, but I think that tends to be that the audience will go to all of these different sites, and you're not really engaging with the city. I mean, one thing I'm trying to do in this World War II exhibit is to make sure that it's very place-based. So there's a lot of the World War II landscape that, if you know where to look, still exists in New York. So to the extent that I can, I'm using that as the basis for the displays in the exhibit, so that when people go out into the city, they're going to recognize the places that they saw inside. And I hope that there'll be a kind of a stronger interplay between the outside and the inside. And maybe as I get more sophisticated in this arena, you know, I can use social media or other kinds of new technologies to literally bring the outside in. But those are just my ideas. I've yet to prove that.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking.